Welcome to Dark Case Desk. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel. Today we delve into a chilling, unsolved mystery, the death of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey, a true crime case that has haunted America for decades. This documentary-style exploration will recount the facts of the case in a flowing narrative, in the hope of shedding light on what really happened in Boulder, Colorado, on that tragic Christmas night. It was the night of Christmas Day, 1996, in the quiet college town of Boulder. The Ramsey family, parents John and Patsy, 10-year-old son Burke, and 6-year-old JonBenét, had spent the day celebrating the holiday. JonBenét, a bright and lively kindergartner who had recently won a Little Miss Beauty pageant, was the center of attention that day. She'd unwrapped presents, including a new bicycle, under the glow of Christmas lights. That evening, the Ramseys attended a Christmas dinner at the home of their family friends, Fleet and Priscilla White. It was a joyous gathering filled with laughter, good food, and holiday cheer. JonBenét played happily with the Whites' children, showing off her pageant smile, while the adults chatted over wine. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Later that night, the Ramseys returned home to their large Tudor-style house at 755 15th Street in Boulder. It was late, near midnight, when they pulled into the driveway. The air was cold and still, with snow on the ground as remnants of a white Christmas. Inside the house, twinkling Christmas tree lights cast a warm glow in the living room. JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car, exhausted from the excitement of the day. John Ramsey carried his daughter upstairs to her bedroom, and Patsy helped get the drowsy child into her cozy white knit shirt and floral long johns pajama pants. JonBenét was gently tucked into bed for the night. Her older brother, Burke, went to bed as well. The parents finally went to sleep in the master bedroom, unaware that this peaceful holiday scene was about to descend into a nightmare. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 26, 1996, just after 5:30 a.m., Patsy Ramsey awoke in the family's third-floor bedroom. Still dressed in the same clothes she'd worn to the party, a red sweater and black velvet pants, Patsy headed down the back staircase toward the kitchen to make herself a cup of coffee and start the morning. As she descended the spiral stairs, something on the steps caught her eye. Several sheets of paper laid out on one of the lower steps. Curious, Patsy picked up the papers and realized it was a handwritten letter. As she read the first lines, panic began to seize her. It was a ransom note claiming that JonBenét had been kidnapped. The letter was 2.5 pages long, unusually lengthy for a ransom note. It stated that JonBenét was being held by a small foreign faction and demanded a sum of $118,000 for her safe return. You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in $100 bills and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills, the note specified. Patsy's eyes widened. $118,000 was eerily close to the amount of her husband, John's most recent annual bonus. Who could have known that detail? The letter warned the Ramseys not to contact police or friends, or their daughter would be killed. Despite the threat, a terrified Patsy immediately screamed for her husband and then dialed 911 on their house phone at 5:52 a.m. "There's been a kidnapping. My daughter is missing," Patsy frantically told the emergency operator. She struggled to get the words out, gasping for breath as she explained that she'd found a ransom note for her 6-year-old daughter. In the recorded 911 call, Patsy's voice was high-pitched and distraught as she pleaded for help. The dispatcher dispatched officers to the address. Patsy hung up, but the phone line remained connected a moment longer than she realized. On later analysis of the tape, some listeners believed they could hear faint voices in the background, possibly John's and even one that sounded like young Burke's, asking questions or exclaiming in the chaos. This would become a point of controversy, because the Ramseys initially said Burke remained asleep in bed throughout the incident. However, enhanced audio much later suggested Burke's voice might have been overheard in the background of the 911 call, indicating he was awake. Regardless, within minutes, police were on their way. At 5:55 a.m., just 3 minutes after Patsy's call, the first officers from the Boulder Police Department arrived at the Ramsey residence. Officers Rick French and Barry Weiss walked up to the house, which looked tranquil from the outside, icicle lights from Christmas still hanging under the eaves. Patsy, still in the same clothes and now in a state of utter panic, met them at the door. She led them to the back staircase where the ransom note lay. John Ramsey, normally a composed and successful businessman, looked visibly shaken and was reading over the note with trembling hands. The officers quickly read the bizarre letter. It was written in a rambling style, full of oddly dramatic threats and movie-like lines. "Listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction," it began. The writer insisted they respected John's business but not the country it served, and warned that if the Ramseys wanted to see their daughter alive, they must follow instructions to the letter. The kidnappers claimed they would call John tomorrow between 8 and 10 a.m. to instruct on delivering the money. The note threatened that any deviation from the orders, contacting authorities, marking bills, speaking to anyone, would result in JonBenét's immediate execution. Chillingly, it even warned, "If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies." The letter was signed SBTC and ended with the strange exclamation, **victory, **. The content and tone were highly unusual, even to the responding officers. A Federal Bureau of Investigation agent later noted that a ransom note of such length, roughly 370 words, was extremely uncommon to be written at the scene. Moreover, the note had peculiar phrasings suggestive of lines from crime movies. To the police, it immediately looked like the note could be staged or a red herring. Officer French performed a quick security sweep of the premises, looking for any sign of an intruder or for JonBenet if she might still be in the house. He found no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken window glass or jimmied locks on the ground floor. The Ramseys' home was large, a 15-room, 3-story house with a labyrinthine basement. Officer French headed down into the basement, which was chilly and only partially lit. Moving through the cluttered storage areas, he reached a wine cellar-style door secured with an internal wooden latch up high. He paused briefly at this door. The door was locked or latched from the inside, and thinking a kidnapper would not have been able to exit and then relatch it behind him, French did not open this particular door. He continued checking other basement windows and the garage entry, finding one window in the basement that had been previously broken and left cracked open, possibly by John Ramsey himself on an earlier occasion when he was locked out. French did not notice anything else amiss at that time, and he went back upstairs. JonBenet was still missing without a trace. Given the ransom letter's warning, the police initially treated this as a potential kidnapping rather than a murder, hoping the little girl was still alive somewhere. By 6 a.m., more Boulder police officers and detectives began arriving, as well as victim advocates and friends summoned by the Ramseys. Despite the ransom note's instruction not to call friends, Patsy had phoned several family friends immediately after dialing 911. Soon, close friends like Fleet White and his wife, the same friends whose party the Ramseys attended the night before, and John Fernie, another friend, arrived at the house to support the family. The Ramsey residence quickly filled with people, concerned friends pacing anxiously, officers moving about, and eventually, a victim's advocate and even the family's pastor came by to console them. The scene grew chaotic. In their distraught state, John and Patsy were surrounded by loved ones who tried to comfort them, serving coffee and cleaning up areas of the house to keep things tidy during the crisis. Unbeknownst to them, this well-intentioned activity was disturbing a potential crime scene. Crucial evidence may have been inadvertently wiped away or contaminated as people moved through the home freely. Only JonBenét's bedroom had been taped off by police to preserve evidence, under the assumption she had been abducted from there. The rest of the house was not secured. This would later be regarded as a serious mistake in the investigation, as forensic evidence outside the bedroom was compromised on that first day. While uniformed officers maintained a presence at the house, Boulder detective Linda Arndt was the first detective assigned to the scene, arriving around 8 a.m. Detective Arndt found a tense and emotional household. She tried to take charge of the situation and awaited the kidnappers' promised phone call. The ransom note had said the kidnappers would call by late morning with instructions for the money drop-off. John Ramsey busied himself making arrangements to get the ransom cash, the specified amount of $118,000, by contacting his bank and thinking of how he would get such a sum on short notice. As morning dragged on with no call from any kidnapper, police also brought in a victim advocate to sit with Patsy. The mother was in a state of shock. Wearing the same clothes, makeup smeared from tears, she alternated between praying fervently and staring blankly in disbelief. Hours passed. No call came by 10 a.m. as the ransom note had promised. Detective Arndt continued to monitor the family's movements, noting Patsy's anguish and John's anxious pacing. At one point, Arndt overheard John making calls to arrange a jet. perhaps to pay the ransom or to fly somewhere with the money, showing he was willing to comply with the ransom demands. Despite the instructions, no kidnappers ever called that morning. By late morning of December 26, suspicion quietly began creeping into the minds of some investigators on scene. Was this kidnapping real or a staged setup? FBI experts had informed Boulder police that it was highly unusual for a kidnapping ransom note to be written at the scene, especially one so long. Typically, kidnappers make their demands quickly and leave. The fact that the note was written on paper from inside the Ramsey home, on a notepad belonging to Patsy, and with one of the Ramsey's own Sharpie pens, strongly suggested the note was composed in the house. Even more strangely, investigators found what appeared to be a practice draft of the ransom note in the trash, written on another page from the same notepad. Whoever authored the note had taken time to practice or start over, which again is behavior inconsistent with an intruder hurrying to commit a crime. These peculiarities were noted but not immediately acted upon, as the priority was still to find JonBenét. Outwardly, the police at the house maintained their composure and focus on locating the missing girl. The morning turned into a grim afternoon. By 1 p.m., Detective Arndt was growing uneasy with the lack of progress. With no word from a supposed kidnapper and no sign of JonBenét, she made a decision. She asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to do another thorough search of the house, from top to bottom, to see if anything was out of place or if JonBenét might have been hidden somewhere. Arndt was now the only detective on site, and with the house full of people, her resources were thin. John and Fleet readily agreed, desperate to find any clue. They started their search in the basement, where Officer French had been earlier that morning. John led Fleet down the creaky wooden steps into the dim basement. He methodically went from room to room. Eventually, he reached the same door with the wooden latch that Officer French had noticed. This time, John unlatched and opened it. It was a small wine cellar or storage room, mostly empty, and then he saw her. There, on the cold concrete floor, John Ramsey discovered the lifeless body of his daughter, JonBenét. The little girl was lying on the ground, her favorite white blanket wrapped around her torso. Black duct tape covered her tiny mouth. A length of white nylon cord was cinched around her neck and also loosely tied around one of her wrists, which was extended over her head. JonBenét was still wearing the same pajama top and long johns from the night before. John at first stood in shock. This was the worst possible outcome, the nightmare no parent can fathom. He yelled, "Oh my God, oh my God," in anguish, drawing Fleet White's attention. Fleet ran in and saw the horrific scene. John immediately pulled the duct tape off his daughter's mouth, trying to free her from that ghastly gag. He desperately hoped she might still be alive, though he could see she was not breathing and her body felt cold. In a moment of overwhelming grief, John lifted JonBenét's body off the ground and carried her up the basement stairs, shouting incoherently. Detective Arndt, hearing the commotion, drew her gun instinctively, not knowing if an attacker might be coming up the stairs. But then she saw John Ramsey emerging from the basement, cradling JonBenét's body in his arms and wailing. Patsy let out a piercing scream and rushed toward her child, collapsing on the floor as John laid JonBenét down in the living room. The unimaginable had happened. The kidnapping case had now turned into a homicide before their eyes. Detective Arndt quickly called for backup and an ambulance, but it was far too late. JonBenét was clearly beyond help. Arndt later recounted that she moved JonBenét's body slightly from the hallway to the living room to prevent Patsy from hovering over it. Patsy was sobbing uncontrollably, and John was shouting, "No, no, no," as he knelt beside his daughter. In the chaos and heartbreak of that moment, forensic considerations momentarily fell by the wayside. By John picking up the body and removing the tape, and now multiple people touching the scene, critical evidence had been disturbed or outright lost. The white blanket, for instance, had been moved with the body. Any hairs or fibers on it from a suspect could have been displaced. The cord around JonBenét's neck was loosened when John tried to untie it, potentially obscuring how it had been tied. Later criticism of the investigation would focus heavily on this mishandling of the crime scene in those first moments after discovery. But in fairness, it is hard to fault a grieving father for his instinct to pick up his child, or a mother's to cling to her daughter. The sight of JonBenét's body shattered any remaining hope and plunged the household into deep despair. Police reinforcements soon arrived, and the house was secured as an active crime scene. The Boulder County coroner was notified, and detectives began to treat the Ramsey residence as a potential murder scene rather than a kidnapping location. It was now early afternoon on December 26. John and Patsy, both in utter shock, were separated and taken to different rooms of the house for initial questioning, while investigators began photographing and documenting evidence. The friends who had come to support the Ramseys were asked to leave. Outside, news of the tragedy had begun to spread. Local reporters got wind that a child's body had been found at the affluent family's home, and camera crews started assembling behind the police tape that was going up around the property. By that evening, the coroner's team finally removed JonBenét's body from the house, approximately 10:45 p.m., under the cover of darkness. The small stretcher carrying a black body bag was wheeled out the front door. A jarring sight amid the cheerful holiday decorations still adorning the home. Patsy reportedly cried out, "Bring me my baby." As her daughter's body was taken away, John held his devastated wife, both of them collapsing into grief. The Boulder police had never dealt with a case quite like this. A child had been murdered in her own home, possibly while her family slept upstairs. The next day, December 27, the Boulder County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy to determine exactly how JonBenét died. Though preliminary findings were not immediately released, police announced publicly that the cause of death was strangulation and that the case was now a homicide investigation. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey quickly became national news. The juxtaposition of a brutal killing with the innocent, glamorous images of a child beauty queen captured the public's imagination. JonBenét had been a regular on the child pageant circuit, dressed in glittery costumes, hair coiffed, performing dance routines. After her death, the media broadcast home videos of her pageant performances in an endless loop. JonBenét in cowgirl attire, smiling broadly, JonBenét in a pink tutu blowing kisses. These images were haunting, and they were everywhere. The tragedy had all the elements of a media sensation. A wealthy family, a beautiful child victim, bizarre clues like a ransom note and a garrote, and the backdrop of Christmas. Soon, national and international media coverage focused on JonBenét's pageant history, her parents' social status, and the strange evidence suggesting sexual abuse and staging. The Ramseys became fixtures on tabloid covers, and speculation ran rampant about who could have killed the little girl. Meanwhile, investigators were hard at work, trying to piece together the crime. On December 27, while the Ramseys stayed with friends, police combed through the house for evidence. They discovered certain items that would become crucial to the case. A broken paintbrush in Patsy's art supplies that appeared to be the source of the garrote handle used to strangle JonBenét. Part of a paintbrush that had been snapped off with one end missing. They also noted a bowl of pineapple with a spoon on the kitchen table. This pineapple became significant because the autopsy revealed JonBenét had undigested pineapple in her stomach, indicating she had eaten some not long before her death. Both John and Patsy would later say they did not remember giving JonBenét pineapple that night, and hadn't even noticed the bowl on the table. But photographs taken on December 26 show the bowl of pineapple out in the open, and investigators lifted Patsy's fingerprints from that bowl. This suggested that, at some point late on Christmas night or in the early hours of the 26th, JonBenét had a snack of pineapple. One theory posits that perhaps JonBenét had gotten up after being put to bed and gone downstairs, either on her own or with someone, and eaten pineapple, leading to a confrontation or incident. This detail was one of many that would fuel intense speculation about what sequence of events led to JonBenét's death. The autopsy results, when formally released a few months later, painted a clearer but more disturbing picture of what had been done to JonBenét. The coroner concluded that JonBenét died from asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In simpler terms, she had been strangled with the makeshift garrote tightened around her neck, and she also sustained a severe blow to the head, causing a skull fracture. The autopsy reported an 8.5-inch fracture in her skull from a blunt impact. The combination of strangulation and head injury was lethal. Notably, the head blow may have rendered JonBenét unconscious or even killed her before the garrote was applied. Medical examiners weren't certain of the exact order of injuries. There were no obvious defense wounds on her body, suggesting she may not have fully fought back. She was a small child, and likely incapacitated quickly. Moreover, the autopsy noted signs of possible sexual assault. There was evidence of vaginal injury. Blood spots were observed in her underwear, and abrasions were present in the vaginal area, along with what was described as chronic inflammation that hinted at prior abuse, although this point remains debated. A sexual assault kit found no semen, and tests later confirmed no semen on the body, but that does not rule out sexual contact. The report indicated that her vaginal area appeared to have been wiped clean with a cloth. Investigators also noted that a fragment of the wooden paintbrush used in the garrote was possibly used in the assault, as the broken handle's size was consistent with the vaginal injuries. This was an especially horrifying revelation. It implied a level of sadistic behavior by the perpetrator, or an attempt to stage a sexual assault to mislead investigators. The presence of these injuries meant the crime was not just a simple murder, but potentially a sexual assault and murder of a child, which intensified the urgency to find the killer. From the outset, Boulder police had a delicate task. They needed to investigate the family, as is routine in most child homicides, while also pursuing the possibility of an outside intruder. Statistically, when a young child is murdered in her home, the perpetrator is most often someone in the immediate family or a family acquaintance. By December 26 itself, some investigators privately felt that the evidence, particularly the suspicious ransom note and lack of forced entry, pointed toward the parents staging a kidnapping to cover up something. However, the Ramseys maintained that an unknown intruder must have broken in and killed their daughter. Thus, two parallel theories emerged early on, one that a family member, or someone inside the house, was responsible, and another that an intruder had come in during the night. The Boulder police initially focused strongly on the family theory, even as they publicly said they had not ruled anyone out. JonBenét's parents, John and Patsy, naturally fell under a cloud of suspicion in the public eye almost immediately, a situation that made their every move subject to scrutiny. In the days following JonBenét's death, the Ramseys' behavior drew mixed reactions. On the 28th of December, 1996, just 2 days after finding JonBenét, John and Patsy Ramsey went to the Boulder police station and voluntarily provided hair, blood, and handwriting samples to assist the investigation. They were cooperative in that regard, and both were interviewed in a preliminary manner for a couple of hours that week. Even young Burke was questioned in the first weeks, though as a witness, not a suspect. After giving the samples, the Ramseys decided to leave town. They flew to Atlanta, Georgia, where both John and Patsy had family, and where they had lived before moving to Colorado. JonBenét's funeral was held in Marietta, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, on the 31st of December 1996. At the funeral, JonBenét's small white coffin was laid next to the grave of her older half-sister Elizabeth, John's two-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, who had died in a car accident in 1992. About 200 mourners attended, grieving the loss of the little girl whose face had now been seen on TVs across the country. On the 1st of January 1997, while still in Atlanta, John and Patsy Ramsey gave a remarkable televised interview on CNN, their first public appearance since the tragedy. In the interview, which lasted about 45 minutes, the Ramseys appeared somber and worn. Patsy was heavily medicated on sedatives, as she later acknowledged, but was emphatic as she looked into the camera and delivered a message to the viewers. "There is a killer on the loose," Patsy warned, imploring Boulder residents to keep their children close and safe. She stated, ***, if I were a resident of Boulder, I would tell my friends to keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there. ***. This statement grabbed headlines, as it directly contradicted the Boulder police's assurances at the time that this was an isolated incident. Patsy also went on to lament how America was suffering because we have lost faith in the American family, and she stressed that they were a Christian, God-fearing family who would never harm their children. John Ramsey, sitting beside her, mostly spoke about JonBenét in loving terms and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. This CNN interview was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it showed the Ramseys publicly proclaiming their innocence and fear of an unknown killer, but on the other hand, investigators were surprised they would talk to the media while still avoiding a thorough, formal interview with police in Boulder. In fact, the Boulder detectives had reportedly been told that the Ramseys were too emotional or distraught to speak with them at length, yet here, the couple was on national television giving interviews. This fostered some resentment and suspicion among law enforcement. By early January 1997, the Boulder Police Department had formed a task force and enlisted help from state investigators and even the FBI to work the Ramsey case. They faced immense pressure as media scrutiny mounted. The home on 15th Street was extensively searched again once a warrant was obtained. On the 2nd of January 1997, a group of Boulder detectives flew to Atlanta to follow up with the Ramseys, and also to search the home of John's elderly father, where the Ramseys were staying, for any additional evidence or clues. They even traveled to Charlevoix, Michigan, where the Ramseys owned a summer vacation home, to see if any evidence there might shed light on the case. These searches apparently turned up nothing significant, but it shows how far the investigation reached. A critical piece of evidence, the ransom note, underwent careful analysis. Early announcements by police on January 3 confirmed that the ransom note had been written on paper from a pad inside the Ramsey house. This meant the author likely spent a considerable amount of time in the house composing it, time that an outside intruder normally wouldn't risk. The Boulder police also found bits of practice handwriting, suggesting the writer started a draft and abandoned it. Handwriting experts were brought in to compare samples from John and Patsy to the note. Within the first few months, handwriting analysis reportedly indicated that John Ramsey did not write the note, but results for Patsy were inconclusive. Some experts said there were similarities in Patsy's writing style to the ransom note, though not enough to definitively say it was hers. In fact, a Colorado Bureau of Investigation report pointed to indications that Patsy might be the author, yet it fell short of absolute proof. Later, a federal court would note that 6 certified handwriting experts had excluded Patsy as the note's writer, ruling it highly unlikely she wrote it. However, debate over the ransom letter authorship remains a hot topic. To this day, many are not convinced by those expert opinions, especially since other self-styled experts, some without proper credentials, sensationally accused Patsy in the press. What is clear is that the ransom note's diction was unusual. It included oddly formal greetings like, "Listen carefully," and idioms not common in Patsy's Southern speech. It referenced John directly by name in a taunting way. "Don't try to grow a brain, John," the note says, and employed threats like, "she dies," repeatedly, sounding like lines from Hollywood kidnapping movies. This fueled speculation that the note's writer may have lifted phrases from films. Indeed, analysis later showed similarities to lines in movies such as Dirty Harry and Speed. The sheer length and theatricality of the letter made many investigators suspect it was part of a staged scene rather than a genuine kidnapper's communication. While the physical evidence was being examined, Boulder detectives also conducted interviews with people connected to the Ramseys. They spoke with friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. Some neighbors reported curious things. One neighbor, Melody Stanton, said she was sure she heard a scream in the middle of the night around the time of the murder, a child's scream that abruptly stopped. Another neighbor mentioned seeing lights on in the Ramsey house around midnight. However, no one reported seeing an actual intruder. And notably, none of the Ramseys' immediate neighbors heard anything like a struggle or suspicious activity that night, beyond that single scream, which not everyone heard. One early incident that became a footnote of intrigue. Police discovered that on the 23rd of December, 1996, 3 days before the murder, a 911 call had been placed from the Ramsey home, but the caller hung up without saying anything. An officer had responded to that silent 911 call on the 23rd, knocked on the door, and was told by Patsy that everything was fine, possibly a misdial. It was later reported that this might have been a glitch or a drunk guest at a holiday party dialing accidentally. The Ramseys had hosted a Christmas party at their home on the 23rd, complete with a Santa Claus impersonator, their friend Bill McReynolds, who played Santa for neighborhood kids. The hang-up call was written off as likely accidental, but some observers later wondered if it was a red flag or a prelude to something. Regardless, investigators did not find any direct link between that call and the murder beyond coincidence. As 1997 unfolded, the case seemed to stall publicly while tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Ramseys, feeling under suspicion, hired high-profile defense attorneys and even their own private investigators. They interacted with Boulder authorities largely through their lawyers. Police grew frustrated at what they perceived as the family's lack of full cooperation, while the Ramseys insisted they were being treated as suspects unfairly. In a later statement, Patsy said their reticence in doing extensive police interrogations was because they feared the police were too narrowly focused on them and might not pursue other leads. Indeed, the public atmosphere was accusatory. Tabloids and cable news shows openly speculated that John or Patsy, or both, were hiding something. The notion of a wealthy, seemingly perfect family having a dark secret was an irresistible narrative for media. Investigators did keep working other angles too. They compiled a list of potential outside suspects, which grew to include over 1,600 names by October 1997. This list encompassed anyone who might have had any connection or displayed suspicious interest. Local sex offenders, disgruntled former employees of John's company Access Graphics, neighbors, friends, and even random crazies who falsely confessed, and there were several false confessors over the years. Yet, despite this expansive net, no solid evidence of an intruder emerged in those early months. For instance, the window that was found open in the basement, John Ramsey explained that he himself had broken that window earlier that summer after accidentally locking himself out of the house. It had never been properly repaired. Could an intruder have slipped through that basement window on Christmas night? Detective Lou Smit, a legendary Colorado Springs homicide detective who came out of retirement to assist Boulder County prosecutors in 1997, thought so. Lou Smit joined the case in March 1997 and was struck by certain evidence that he believed pointed to an outside intruder. He noted, for example, that there was an unidentified boot print left in the basement room near where JonBenét's body was found. The print did not match any shoes belonging to the Ramseys. Smit also found a palm print on the door of that basement room that did not immediately match the Ramseys or known visitors. Additionally, a window well grate outside the house, which led down to that broken basement window, had leaves and debris that seemed disturbed. And what about a possible stun gun? Investigators found 2 sets of small dot marks on JonBenét's skin, one on her back and one on her face, that some experts thought looked like marks from a stun gun. The Ramseys themselves, through their lawyers, at one point said they believed a stun gun had been used by the killer to subdue JonBenet. All these clues became pillars of the intruder theory. However, skeptics of the intruder idea pointed out contrary details. The cobwebs around that broken basement window were intact, suggesting no one had crawled through recently. An intruder would have had to navigate a dark house carrying a child or chasing a child without waking anyone, possible but difficult. Why would an intruder kill the child in the home rather than kidnap her for real? Why leave a ransom note if the intent was to kill? And if the intent was kidnapping, why not actually take the body out? Perhaps the intruder panicked, some theorized, and tried to stage a phony kidnapping after accidentally killing JonBenet during a molestation attempt. But if so, that person managed to vanish without leaving much trace of themselves physically, apart from some unknown male DNA mixed with JonBenet's blood. Indeed, DNA evidence was another major component of the case. In early 1997, forensic labs tested samples from JonBenet's clothing and body. They found drops of blood in her underwear that did not come from JonBenet herself. By 1998, it was confirmed that this small amount of blood yielded a DNA profile that did not match any members of the Ramsey family. It was a profile of an unknown male. This was both a promising lead and a puzzlement. The DNA was entered into the FBI's CODIS database to check against millions of offenders. But initially, there was no match. That meant whoever the DNA belonged to had not previously been profiled or convicted of a qualifying offense. Or it could mean the DNA was from some innocent transfer like a factory worker's DNA from clothing manufacturing, an explanation some skeptics later considered. Over the years, this DNA result became a cornerstone for those arguing the Ramseys' innocence. A clear indication that someone else, an unknown male, had a hand in the crime. However, others in law enforcement were more cautious, noting the amount of DNA was trace and could have come from secondary transfer, for example, sneezed or coughed onto fabric at some point, or transferred by touch. In any case, in 1997 the technology and databases were not as advanced as today, so the DNA clue remained just that, a clue without a name. Throughout 1997, the Boulder Police Department continued to work the case amid intense media scrutiny and mounting criticism. The police faced backlash for their handling of the scene and for not making an arrest. Internally, the case began to create divisions. Detective Steve Thomas, one of the lead investigators, grew convinced that Patsy Ramsey was responsible for JonBenet's death, specifically theorizing that Patsy, in a rage or through an accident, killed her daughter and staged the scene. Thomas believed the evidence of staging the note, the wiping of JonBenet's body, the placement of the blanket, all pointed to an inside job. On the opposite side, Detective Lou Smit was steadfast that an intruder did it. These dueling perspectives would shape the investigation's trajectory. Both men eventually resigned from the case. Smit in September 1998 and Thomas earlier in August 1998, each citing frustration that the other side's theory was getting more attention than their own. Smit, upon resigning, even publicly stated his belief that a very dangerous killer is still out there, giving weight to the intruder theory and giving the Ramseys a powerful ally in proclaiming their innocence. Thomas, after resigning, went on to author a scathing book in 2000 JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, accusing the district attorney's office of bowing to powerful lawyers and failing to prosecute the Ramseys. The acrimony between Boulder police and the Boulder district attorney's office became another story in itself, At one point, the Colorado governor had to step in. Governor Roy Romer grew concerned in mid-1998 that the case was mishandled, and he appointed a special prosecutor to move things along. Ultimately, after much public pressure, a grand jury was convened in Boulder County on the 15th of September, 1998, to review the evidence and decide if charges should be brought. For over a year, this grand jury met behind closed doors, hearing testimony from witnesses and examining forensic evidence. The Ramseys themselves did not testify, but police and experts did. Even the Ramseys' then 12-year-old son Burke was secretly questioned by the grand jury in 1999, though only as a witness, and explicitly not as a suspect. The proceedings were secret, but some details leaked, such as the fact that investigators went over the scientific evidence, DNA, fibers, hair, and even took the grand jurors on a tour of the Ramsey house, which had been sold by that point. During this period, crucial developments occurred. In August 1998, Detective Steve Thomas quit, as noted, and wrote an explosive resignation letter accusing the DA's office of crippling the case. Lou Smit quit a few weeks later, convinced of the Ramseys' innocence and upset that police weren't fully pursuing intruder leads. The case had essentially split the investigative team into factions. In the media, speculation continued unabated. One sensational theory emerged that Burke Ramsey, the 9-year-old brother, might have accidentally killed JonBenét over a childish dispute, and that the parents covered it up. This theory was based on evidence like the pineapple, which some suggested JonBenét might have taken from Burke's snack, angering him, and the fact Burke's voice may have been heard on the 911 call, indicating he was awake when the parents said he was asleep. However, early on, both police and the DA stated clearly that Burke was not a suspect. In May 1999, during the grand jury, Burke, now 12, was officially cleared by investigators and considered only a witness. Despite that, the Burke did it theory persisted in some tabloid circles and even among a few law enforcement consultants. This greatly upset the Ramseys, who saw it as ludicrous that a child could cause such injuries, or that they would cover up for him in such an elaborate way. John and Patsy vehemently defended Burke, and by all accounts, Burke had been a child who adored his sister. The grand jury completed its work in October 1999. On the 13th of October 1999, the Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter announced that there would be no charges filed because there was insufficient evidence to prosecute anyone. What the public didn't know then was that the grand jury had actually voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder, but for charges related to child abuse resulting in death, essentially alleging that they had placed JonBenét in a situation leading to her death and perhaps aided or abetted the killer. The indictment also mentioned they possibly hindered the prosecution of the person responsible. In other words, the grand jury suspected the parents of covering up knowledge of the killer. DA Hunter, however, did not sign that indictment. Believing he could not prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard required at trial, and possibly doubting the parents' guilt altogether, Hunter chose to let the grand jury expire without issuing charges. For years, the outcome of the grand jury was kept secret, and most people assumed the grand jury had ended inconclusively. It wasn't until 2013 that the true bill to indict the Ramseys was revealed through court-ordered unsealing of documents. The revelation that a grand jury actually wanted to charge the Ramseys, albeit for lesser charges than murder, added a new layer of controversy. Some saw it as vindication for the Ramseys are guilty camp, while others noted it wasn't a murder indictment and still didn't prove who killed JonBenét. Throughout the grand jury period, the Ramseys maintained a very public stance of innocence. In mid-1997, they moved permanently back to the Atlanta area, away from the Boulder spotlight. Patsy, who had been a Miss West Virginia in her youth and had an outgoing personality, occasionally spoke at events or with authors to defend herself. In early 2000, the Ramseys published a book, The Death of Innocence, telling their side of the story. They wrote about their experience, their belief that an intruder killed JonBenét, and their frustration with the investigation. This led to a couple of defamation lawsuits. People named in their book as suspects, for example, a journalist named Chris Wolfe, whom they hinted at, sued them, and the Ramseys prevailed in court. In one civil case, decision in 2003 Wolfe v. Ramsey, a judge explicitly wrote that there was abundant evidence that an intruder committed the crime and virtually no evidence that the Ramseys did. That statement by Judge Julie Carnes heartened those who believed in the Ramseys' innocence, although it was not part of a criminal proceeding, just a libel suit ruling. The early 2000s saw new leadership and new approaches. In 2002, a new Boulder County District Attorney, Mary Lacey, took over the case from the police. Lacey was sympathetic to the intruder theory. She brought Lou Smith back as an advisor and refocused on finding an outside suspect. This shift angered some Boulder police, who still felt the case pointed to the family. One former Boulder police chief would later call Lacey's approach a big slap in the face to detectives who worked the case. Nonetheless, Lacey's team made progress on the forensic front. In 2003, they were able to extract a more complete DNA profile from that tiny blood sample in JonBenét's underwear. They found it belonged to an unknown male, as earlier indicated, and made sure it was checked against everyone. It did not match John, Patsy, Burke, or anyone in the immediate circle. By 2008, armed with advanced touch DNA testing techniques, which can detect skin cell DNA from just contact, Lacey's office announced that all members of the Ramsey family were officially excluded from the DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. Mary Lacey went so far as to write a letter of apology to John Ramsey, publicly declaring the Ramseys completely cleared in the case. This was an unprecedented move. It's rare for law enforcement to exonerate individuals so publicly in an open investigation. Lacey's letter stated that the unknown DNA was, in her view, the killer's, and that the Ramseys, having been excluded from that DNA, should no longer be under suspicion. However, not everyone in law enforcement agreed with Lacey's conclusion. The new Boulder police chief, in 2009, and other investigators cautioned that the DNA evidence, while important, might not be the end-all proof of an intruder. They noted the possibility of innocent transfer, or that the DNA could be from a third party not involved in the murder. Former Chief Mark Beckner said in 2015 that clearing people based on a small DNA sample that hasn't been proven connected to the crime was absurd. He did acknowledge that the source of that DNA is the biggest clue we have, and likely belongs to the killer if it ever can be matched. Another expert pointed out that because the crime scene was not secure in the beginning, trace DNA could have come from anywhere. So, while DNA dramatically shifted the official stance in favor of the Ramseys' innocence, it did not universally settle the matter for everyone involved. A dramatic twist occurred in August 2006 that momentarily seemed like a breakthrough. A 41-year-old American schoolteacher named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, after he contacted a University of Colorado journalism professor and essentially confessed to killing JonBenét. Carr, who had been obsessed with the case, claimed in emails that he was present when JonBenét died. He provided some details, saying he accidentally killed her during a botched kidnapping after drugging and sexually assaulting her. This sensational development made international headlines. Could this be the murderer finally coming to light nearly 10 years later? Boulder authorities flew Carr back to the U.S. amid a media frenzy. However, very quickly, doubts emerged. Carr's story did not fit the facts. JonBenét had no drugs in her system, according to the autopsy, contradicting his claim of drugging her. Carr seemed to know only information that had been public. Crucially, when his DNA was tested against the unknown male DNA from the crime scene, it did not match. Within days, it was clear Carr was a false confessor with deep psychological issues and a history of obsession with little girls. The charges against him in the Ramsey case were dropped. He was briefly held on unrelated child pornography charges in California, which also ended up being dropped on technicalities. The John Mark Carr episode was a huge disappointment to investigators and the Ramsey family, but in some ways, it underscored just how desperate people were to solve the case. It also highlighted how many disturbed individuals were drawn to the notoriety of this crime, some even claiming responsibility for attention. Tragically, while the search for JonBenét's killer dragged on, the Ramsey family suffered another blow. Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's mother, passed away from ovarian cancer in June 2006 at the age of 49. Patsy had been battling cancer on and off since before JonBenét's death. She was a survivor of a previous bout in the early 1990 seconds. She died with the case still unsolved, and with many in the public still wrongly suspecting her. She was laid to rest next to JonBenét in Georgia. Patsy never lived to see the formal exoneration by DNA that came 2 years later. John Ramsey, after Patsy's death, continued to cooperate and occasionally speak out about the case. He eventually remarried years later and tried to find some semblance of a normal life, though he remained determined to see his daughter's killer found. With the turn of the decade, Boulder police took back control of the investigation from the DA's office in 2009, They reopened the case as a cold case, and in 2010, they conducted fresh interviews with various witnesses and former suspects. However, those yielded no major new information. The case was destined to remain a lingering mystery. Every so often, new headlines would pop up, but often they were more about the media surrounding the case than the case itself. For example, in 2012 to 2013, that's when it came to light that the grand jury had wanted to indict the Ramseys back in 1999. In 2016, 2 decades after the murder, multiple TV documentaries and retrospectives came out, reigniting public interest. One of them, a high-profile CBS special titled The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, assembled a panel of experts, including a former FBI profiler and forensic investigators, to re-examine the evidence. This CBS program controversially concluded that Burke Ramsey, the brother, might have been the culprit. The scenario suggested was that Burke, age 9, hit JonBenét with a heavy object like a flashlight in anger over her taking some pineapple, and the parents then staged the scene to protect him. This theory had been floated before in forums and by Steve Thomas, but to see it on network television stunned many and infuriated the Ramsey family. Burke Ramsey, who had always been a very private individual, responded by filing a defamation lawsuit against CBS, the production company, and one of the experts, Dr. Werner Spitz. He sought an astonishing $750 million in damages, arguing that the accusations were based on a compilation of lies, half-truths, and outright fabrications, and had permanently smeared his name. CBS stood by its show initially, but in January 2019, they reached a confidential settlement with Burke to end the lawsuit. This outcome implied that perhaps the network wanted to avoid a courtroom fight, and Burke's legal team considered it a victory. It also served as a cautionary tale in true crime media. Even decades-old cases can have legal repercussions if theories are presented as accusatory. In a more personal move, Burke Ramsey also broke his long public silence in September 2016. He gave an interview to Dr. Phil McGraw on national television, his first public interview about his sister's death since it happened. Burke was now 29 years old. In the interview, he came across as somewhat awkward and nervous, smiling oddly at times, which unfortunately some viewers misinterpreted as suspicious or strange. In reality, it was likely just his discomfort on camera. He firmly denied any involvement in JonBenét's death, as he always had, and he put forth his own guess on what happened. Asterisk, asterisk, I think some pedophile in the pageant audience saw her. Asterisk, asterisk, Burke theorized that someone who had seen JonBenét at a pageant or around town had targeted her. This was the same thought John and Patsy had held, that perhaps an obsessed stranger fixated on JonBenét's public pageant persona. Burke's interview did not reveal any bombshell evidence. It mainly showed that after all these years, the surviving brother still lived under the shadow of this tragedy. Over the years, numerous names cropped up as possible intruders. One early suspect was the aforementioned Bill McReynolds, the kindly neighbor who played Santa Claus at the Ramseys' Christmas party on the 23rd. He had given JonBenét a card saying she'd get a special gift after Christmas. In a bizarre coincidence, McReynolds' own daughter had been abducted 22 years earlier and survived, and his wife had once written a play about a child getting murdered in a basement. These odd parallels made him a focus of suspicion for a time, but McReynolds was elderly, had health issues, and there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. He gave hair, handwriting, and blood samples willingly and was eventually cleared. Another person of interest was Linda Hoffman Pugh, the Ramseys' housekeeper. She knew the family's schedule and financial info and had a key to the house. Linda had even told police Patsy could have hurt JonBenét. She had her own suspicions about Patsy's temper. But again, no direct evidence linked her, and she had an alibi. A local Boulder journalist, Chris Wolf, was turned in by his girlfriend who thought some behavior of his was odd around the time of the murder. He sued the Ramseys after they named him as a suspect in their book, but as noted, a judge found nothing tying Wolf to the crime and dismissed his suit. Another chilling lead was Michael Helgoth, a young man who lived near Boulder and reportedly told a friend he was going to make a lot of money around the time of JonBenét's murder. Helgoth died in an apparent suicide in February 1997. Shortly after, the DA had publicly hinted that they were closing in on a suspect. Next to Helgoth's body was a stun gun and a pair of high-tech brand boots, which some thought could match the mysterious boot print in the Ramsey basement. This looked suspicious to some investigators, especially Lou Smith, but Helgoth's DNA didn't match, and he was never formally linked beyond circumstantial intrigue. There was also Gary Oliva, a known sex offender in Boulder who reportedly had an obsession with JonBenét. He was found with a magazine cutout of JonBenét in his backpack in 2000. And in 2016, he was arrested on child pornography charges. Some letters surfaced in 2019 where Oliva allegedly confessed to a friend that he killed JonBenét by accident. However, his DNA also did not match the crime scene, and many believe his confession was false or delusional. In short, a number of possible suspects emerged, but none could be tied definitively to the crime. It often seemed like for every piece of evidence pointing towards an intruder, there was a caveat or contradiction preventing a clear resolution. For example, Lou Smith's intruder theory highlighted an important clue: the unknown male DNA on JonBenét's clothes. Additionally, Smith argued that marks on JonBenét's body were consistent with a stun gun, and that a stun gun is not something the Ramseys owned or would use on their child. He thought the presence of the garrote, a weapon more likely used by a sadistic offender, supported the idea of a psychopath intruder. Smith even created a slideshow of crime scene photos and theories, which eventually became public. He remained an advocate for the Ramseys until his death in 2010, and his work influenced Mary Lacey's decision to exonerate the family. On the other hand, those suspicious of the family noted things like fibers from Patsy's jacket being found entwined in the cord around JonBenét, implying Patsy could have been present when the garrote was made or used. They also pointed to the strange behavior of the Ramseys after the fact. That morning, John went missing for an hour, supposedly to pick up the mail, though some found that odd during a crisis, and that both John and Patsy arranged to fly to Atlanta just hours after their daughter's body was found, before police asked them to stay. Such actions were seen by some as avoiding law enforcement. The family theory proponents often come back to the ransom note, that it's the strongest evidence of staging, because its content seems tailored to John using his bonus amount, using movie-like language, and it appears to be written by someone in the house with time to spare. If an intruder came to kidnap, why kill the child and then absurdly write a long note? If the intruder came to molest, kill, why bother with a ransom note at all? The simplest answer, some felt, there was no intruder, and the note was a prop. However, absent a confession or direct evidence, this remained speculative. The years rolled on, and JonBenét's case grew cold. Every year, typically around Christmas, media would revisit it, sometimes with new interviews or experts, sometimes just rehashing the known facts. The Boulder police always stated that the case was open and active, albeit in a cold case status, with detectives assigned to periodically review any new info. They would also periodically release statements on the anniversary of the crime, often noting that dozens and dozens of suspects had been looked at and hundreds of DNA samples tested. One interesting facet is the number of defamation lawsuits that sprang from this case. Apart from Burke's big lawsuit, the Ramseys or their associates filed suits against tabloids like The Star and people who went too far in accusations. For example, one suit targeted an internet poster who implicated a family friend, leading to a settlement. The case became a cautionary arena for free speech. Many TV commentators and authors had to be careful to label their theories as conjecture, because Burke in particular was ready to defend his name. The swirl of innuendo that had surrounded the family slowly receded post-2000s as public opinion shifted somewhat. By the time 20 years had passed, there was more sympathy that perhaps the Ramseys were unfairly maligned, especially after the DNA exclusion in 2008. Still, polls would show a significant portion of Americans remained convinced someone in the family was involved. In terms of dramatic retellings, the JonBenét case inspired multiple books, TV movies, and even fictionalized accounts. It is arguably one of the most written about and discussed murder cases of the late 20th century. Everyone had an opinion. Retired FBI profilers, forensic pathologists on talk shows, criminal psychologists, former detectives, armchair web sleuths on internet forums. The debate was endless. Was it an intruder, perhaps a pedophile from her pageant life, as some suggested? One author, Stephen Singular, posited that JonBenét could have been targeted by someone involved in child pornography and that the family's involvement in pageants inadvertently put her at risk? Or was it a tragic family secret covered up by parents desperately trying to protect themselves or their son? The truth remained elusive. As of 2025, JonBenét's murder remains officially unsolved. A cold case, but not a closed one. However, hope has not faded. Technological advances in DNA analysis, particularly techniques like genetic genealogy that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, offer new avenues. In November 2022, the Boulder Police Department announced it was partnering with the Colorado Cold Case Review Team to take a fresh look at the case using modern technology. They plan to re-examine the evidence with advanced DNA testing methods and also digitize and organize case files to glean fresh insights. Then, in December 2023, that cold case team delivered recommendations to Boulder PD on possible next steps. While the exact content of those recommendations remains confidential, the police stated they were reviewing and prioritizing them. There is optimism that traces of DNA that were too minute to analyze before might now yield profiles, or that previously untested evidence like the ligature cord, the paintbrush handle, JonBenét's clothing, or the undergarments could be tested with more sensitive techniques to possibly identify the unknown male, or even multiple contributors, as some tests in 2016 indicated there might be DNA from two individuals besides JonBenét on her clothing. If a profile can be built, genealogical databases might help track down a relative of the suspect, potentially cracking the case all these years later. For John Ramsey, now in his 80 seconds, and Burke Ramsey, now a man in his 30 seconds, the prospect of answers is bittersweet. They have lived under a cloud for so long, but they have also always said they just want to know who did it. Especially if an intruder indeed killed JonBenét, that person could conceivably still be at large. The Boulder police insist they continue to follow up on every tip, of which they say they've received thousands over the decades. JonBenét would be a young woman of 35 years old this year had she lived. A fact that resonates sadly with many who remember her as a 6-year-old in pageant costumes. The legacy of this case is complex. It undoubtedly changed the way high-profile crimes are covered in the media, with 24/7 news cycles, the invasion of privacy for grieving families, and the consequences of trial by media. It also served as a textbook example of investigative missteps, securing crime scenes, managing law enforcement, turf wars, and the perils of tunnel vision. But beyond all the sensationalism, at the heart of this story is a little girl who was brutally killed on Christmas, and she has never gotten justice. As we conclude this deep dive, we reflect on the facts. JonBenét Ramsey was a vibrant, charismatic child who should have had a full life ahead. Instead, her name has become synonymous with one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. Her case remains open, and detectives say they will not give up until it is solved. Perhaps one day, through persistence or new science, we will finally learn the truth of what happened in that Boulder home so many years ago and see justice served. Thank you for watching this investigation on Dark Case Desk. If you found this documentary informative, please like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts on the case. Don't forget to subscribe to Dark Case Desk for more in-depth true crime stories. We appreciate your support, and until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next video.